This is the last class in which I will make any kind of presentation. Next week is our last class, and I would like to reserve that class entirely for discussion of questions, propositions, and proposals that you may bring, related or not to the papers that you will be writing. So please do think of how you can contribute to next week's discussion. And the theme today is the normative element in the arguments of the course. Last week, I discussed the explanatory element, the assumptions about structural change, structural discontinuity, structural alternatives in history, and their consequences for our ideas about political and social agency. Today's discussion about the normative assumptions of the arguments of the course, I propose to organize in 3 steps. In the first step, I want to restate the account I presented at the beginning of the course of the normative orientation of this argument and how it contrasts with the common position of contemporary progressives. In the second step, I propose briefly to explore the status of our assumptions about human nature and the relation of ideas about human nature to programmatic arguments like those that I have developed and we have discussed in this course. And then in the third step of my remarks today, I want to outline further the substance of the conception of human nature that informs these programmatic arguments. So first, the normative perspective, returning to remarks I made at the outset of the course, and the way it contrasts with the position of contemporary progressives. One way of interpreting the progressive position today, especially with respect to its characteristics as a normative argument, is to say that it generally combines a profession of egalitarian faith with an institutional conservatism or agnosticism. So the most common way to distinguish today who is a progressive is to say that the progressive is the one who gives priority to equality, at least equality of opportunity, and often as well some form of equality of circumstance or outcome. But this profession of egalitarian faith in the position of the contemporary progressives is characteristically combined with a conservative or at least an agnostic attitude to the institutional background of society and the institutional arrangements of the economy and of politics. So that means that the tendency of the contemporary progressives is to accept, in general terms, the way in which the economy, the regulated market economy, is now organized, and the way in which democratic politics is now organized. And in some way to make the best of this present form of organization. To make the best of it by humanizing it in some form. And by reconciling it with the egalitarian ideal. Now, how are we to understand the significance of this combination of an egalitarian commitment with an institutional conservatism or agnosticism? It seems that if we add up these two elements, the practical sum, the residue of this combination, is a commitment to policies that achieve the greatest amount of equality that is compatible with the preservation of the present structure, the present institutional structure of the economy and of politics. And in particular, that means the attempt to achieve greater equality by correcting, after the fact, the inequalities generated in the course of economic activity. The economic activity shaped by the present economic arrangements. So the market is seen as an engine of efficiency and of growth. Unfortunately, it produces too much inequality. And then the inequality is to be corrected retrospectively through tax and transfer. That is to say, through progressive taxation on the revenue-raising side of the budget and redistributive social entitlements on the spending side of the budget. That's a simple, practical summary of the gist of much of the contemporary progressive position. And this view is theorized in the philosophies of distributive justice that are ascendant now, especially in the Anglo-American Academy. So there's something really strange about these philosophies of justice, which is that if you take them literally, they seem to be radically egalitarian. So they would be revolutionary, they would be incendiary in the class structures that exist in the actual world. But then you look at what their focus is, and their focus is the philosophical justification of these practices of compensatory and retrospective redistribution, which is one of the main concerns of the mid-20th century social democratic settlement. And the mid-20th century social democratic settlement is anything but incendiary and revolutionary. So there's this big philosophical apparatus, various contraptions, philosophical contraptions are mobilized, like the social contract idea. But at the end of the day, this vast philosophical apparatus produces something entirely familiar. It is as if it were a philosophical gloss, I think a pseudo-philosophical gloss, on the homely and conventional practices of compensatory and retrospective redistribution under social democracy. Now, why do I call it a pseudo-philosophical gloss? Because in much of this supposedly philosophical work, and in the debates among these philosophers and theorists, it's as if they all agreed on the bottom line. The bottom line is some form of liberal social democracy. with more equality than now exists. And what then do they debate? They debate about the top line. That is, in what philosophical vocabulary or from what philosophical premises should this conclusion, on which they already agree, be deduced? So, mirror, mirror on the wall, tell me which is the most persuasive, the most beautiful philosophical vocabulary of all. But the result is already known from the beginning. Now, that's, of course, not philosophy. That's some kind of shell game. That's some kind of ornamentation, right? Because philosophy, like poetry, like anything, like any great human activity, is supposed to be a storm that carries us in a direction that we didn't intend. It's not supposed to be an adornment of what we already believed, and a way of making it seem more prestigious and more plausible. So that's the contemporary position on the whole of the progressives, in which thought, pseudo-philosophical thought, betrays its vocation and serves as an apology for this mendacious combination of superficial radicalism with underlying conservatism. Now, at the beginning of the course, I contrasted this position with what I take to be the heart of the position of the progressives, both liberals and socialists, in the 19th century. And indeed, I want to argue that the classical progressive position, meaning by classical the 19th century, diverged from both these elements. So let's begin with the second element, the institutional conservatism or agnosticism. The 19th century liberals and socialists pin their hopes on some structural transformation that included as a central part a change in the economic and political institutions. And each sect of the progressives, each school of thought, each ideological position had its institutional formula, its dogmatic formula. So for the liberals, it was the system of private rights against the background of an organization of liberal democracy that would sustain the system of private rights. And for the socialists, it was the control, the command, the guidance of the economy by the state. And so a different institutional formula, which we could call broadly statist. So they believed that there was no hope of advancing their project without fundamental institutional renovation in society, in both the organization of the economy and the organization of the state. And then what about their goal? Now here it's less clear what the difference is. But I do want to argue that the core of their goal was not equality. That the core of their goal was an idea of our ascent, of the ascent of the ordinary man and woman, of the mass of common humanity, to a higher form of life. Empowerment, greatness. Greatness is the central idea in politics, and always has been, or almost always has been. whether it is conservative politics or radical politics. And the question always is, how is greatness manifest? And how is it distributed within the mass of humanity? So the anxiety, the characteristic anxiety of the liberal theoreticians about democracy, for example, the anxiety manifest in the writings and ideas of thinkers like Tocqueville or Herzen or von Humboldt or John Stuart Mill, was that the democratic transformation, rather than producing a spread of greatness, of power, of capability, would result in the creation of a society of sheep, of conformists. So you would go from aristocratic dominion and self-assertion, then to democratic conformity and belittlement. That was their anxiety. And their anxiety reveals very clearly what their real ideal was. Their real ideal was greatness. Not in the form that would restrict it to an elite, a social aristocratic elite, or a meritocratic elite, an elite of heroes, geniuses, and saints, but that would disseminate this higher power, this greater agency in ordinary humanity. Now, this is not to say that they were not concerned with equality. But on the whole, they viewed equality, the ideal of equality, or rather the commitment to combat extreme and entrenched forms of inequality, as subsidiary to the higher goal of greatness, of shared greatness. Because an entrenched inequality would be incompatible with greatness. That was their characteristic goal. And so you could say their goal was shared greatness, and their method was structural change through some conversion of society to a different set of institutional arrangements. Now, if that is so, this is a remarkable change in the character of the progressive position from the 19th century to the late 20th century and today. A change in both the goal and the method. So it should be obvious by now that the position that has animated my arguments and proposals in the course is much closer to the 19th century view than to this late 20th century view. And I have wanted, in a way, to retake the broken thread of the earlier view. Now, in doing that, I recognize that we can't just continue or restate the earlier position. The earlier view of greatness was too narrow. We need a more capacious view of greatness, one which admits a wider range of human experience. And one not formed on the narrow model of the aristocratic ideal of self-possession. Now, it's interesting that this effect of the aristocratic ideal of self-possession set its mark even on the thinking of the leftist views. If you read Karl Marx's early philosophical writings about human nature, in many ways they project this aristocratic idea. So the squire living in his little dominion, Montesquieu retreating from society, or Montaigne Well, that will be everyone. So it's a simple extension of this aristocratic ideal to general humanity. But what is even clearer is that the method that they propose, that is their idea of structural change, is not acceptable. So each of the sects, each of the tendencies, had its institutional formula, its blueprint. So it says, adopt the system of liberal rights, or the statist formula, and we will at last be free and great. Now, a lot has happened since then. And we have witnessed all the calamities and misadventures of the 20th century conducted under the aegis of these revolutionary ideologies. We know a lot more about what really happens and what happened in the past. And for all these reasons, we can no longer bring ourselves to believe in these dogmatic institutional formulas, in the existence of a definitive institutional blueprint. And so we have what I described in an earlier class as a problem, and also an opportunity, that has no historical precedent, which is that we have reason to recognize, as the 19th century liberals and socialists did, the primacy of structural change. But equally, we have reason not to confide in any structural dogmatism, unlike the liberals and socialists of the 19th century. So how are we to solve this problem? So one of the many implications is that among the attributes of the institutions, of the economic and political institutions, and of the form of education that we should desire, is that it help organize and facilitate and accelerate its own revision in the light of experience. That these arrangements be corrigible, and that they not have to await trauma crisis to achieve correction. And you've seen throughout the semester how this concern has played a major role in all of the arguments and proposals that I've discussed with you. And they could all be brought under the label of experimentalism. But that's what experimentalism means. Now then there's a paradox or a subtlety, which is this, that experimentalism is not something empty, it's not a vacuum. So it doesn't mean anything goes or anything is as good as anything else. Given our very restricted points of departure, which are the institutional arrangements and the institutional ideas available now in the world, a repertory that we can enlarge only with great difficulty, both conceptually and in practice. We may need particular institutions, particular economic and political institutions to organize this experimentalism. So in the arguments of the course, one major instance of this experimentalism is the disseminated and radicalized form of the knowledge economy. And another instance is what I have called high-energy democracy, with a heightened level of organized popular mobilization, an acceleration of the pace of politics, and a combination of strong central initiative with faculties for local deviation. Now, finally, this vision of the normative perspective can be translated into another vocabulary, which may help understand its intentions. And the vocabulary is this. So you could say that on the surface, the ideological debate that exists in the world between progressives or leftists and conservatives, between the left and the right, is a contest between those who give priority to equality and those who give priority to freedom. That's the conventional view of the situation today. Against the background of broad acceptance of the established institutional arrangements of the economy and of democratic politics, of the market economy and of democratic politics. So you could describe this as a contest between shallow equality and shallow freedom. Shallow because they both presuppose the established institutional background rather than contesting it. Now, the limits of this vision of the contest of what's at stake are soon revealed by a simple thought experiment. Imagine that you relax the assumption that I am describing here as the assumption of shallowness. That is to say, the acceptance of the institutional background. And you lift that assumption and you allow for transformation of the background, even radical transformation. Now, when that happens, what then is the aim of the leftists or of the progressives? Is it what you could call deep equality? Equality at any price? Now, we have examples of what that means. If not in historical reality, then at least in political mythology. So you can imagine a society like a simplified or mythologized version of ancient Sparta. The free Spartans, forget about the slaves, the dependents. And they're more or less equal. There are rules guaranteeing equality, the same circumstance, and there's a mechanism of radical redistribution. So there can't be any significant economic accumulation. Any significant accumulation will be canceled out by the rules, by the laws. For example, with respect to land, the prohibition of the alienation of land. Everyone will have a stake. The stake will be more or less the same. Now that, of course, is incompatible with economic dynamism. And then what it points toward is an egalitarian frugality. That's what radical equality would mean. Now, it's a very simple observation. Who wants that? No one. Almost no one wants that. And that has never been the objective of the leftists or the progressives in the modern world. Maybe of the ancient Spartans, if we were to believe this mythology, but not of the modern progressives. So it doesn't make any sense. Now, what did they want then? Not deep equality, but deep freedom. And what is deep freedom? It's the enhancement of agency, of capability, of scope, of engagement, incompatible, of course, with entrenched inequality. But the focus, the access, the impulse is freedom, not equality. So in this simple experiment, then, of the progression of the progressive view, of the leftist view, it goes from shallow equality to deep freedom. It doesn't go from shallow equality to deep equality. And that's then a crucial point in the argument. And it changes the whole agenda of political theory as well as of practical politics, because the central concern, the highest concern, is no longer who gets what. There is that concern, who gets what. The central concern is who is what. And how do we become bigger than we now are together? That's the central idea. Well, that's the first set of things I wanted to say, and it's really just a restatement of my initial position. It's interesting that, in a sense, everything that I've just said is sort of obvious, very simple. But somehow this is not what is said in the world. So something is wrong. And we can't bring about this change of view, of attitude, simply at the level of abstractions. We have to engage in this detailed debate about the alternatives. If someone believes there are no alternatives, then this discussion sort of loses its sense. On the other hand, the discussion can't be just about the tangible alternatives. The ideas and the assumptions matter. So that's what I wanted to say in this first step. Yes?
So I'm very glad that we talk about the 19th century and the
Yes.
20th century, because there's something very problematic when someone says, like, you can conclude from someone elaborate thought that everybody got it wrong. It's very problematic because, after all, some of the forced socialists did something which was very hard in a time that was, some of the things that they wrote is very visionary to when you look at the society they lived in. And I ask myself, when I look at the argument between Jaurès and Gade, between the Marx and Lassalle, between the social democrats to the communists, if you can say.
Yes.
I see that a lot of the arguments that shouldn't have resulted in another blueprint,
Yes.
Was very, very true. That if you will try to correct the system within the same parameters, you will end up the same. And I think that
By the parameters, you mean the institutional parameters? What do you mean?
yes, the institutional parameters.
Yes.
You know, like in the end, Bernstein, when he said, let's establish a social democracy.
Yes.
And it seems reasonable because I'm a liberal. I don't want like.
Well, it's interesting, if you would allow me just to make a comment about your particular example. So, an emphasis of many of the social democrats, like Lassalle and his collaborators, was the development of so-called collaborative or solidaristic forms of economic activity, which Marx ridiculed. But there is a problem in these cooperativist ideas, which is that for the most part, they relied on the existing apparatus of private law the existing forms of property and contract, including the unified property right of the 19th century. And so then there's a dilemma, which was very clearly revealed, for example, in the Yugoslav system of self-management, of two things. One, on the one hand, these cooperatives would be allowed to grow, to accumulate. Some would prosper, others would fail. That's one possibility. In that event, then, the ones that would grow would buy out the other ones. There would be two tiers of workers, the owners of the successful ones and the wage labor of the unsuccessful ones. And so the existing economic order would be reproduced. So then the cooperativist movement would turn out to be a transitory interlude. On the other hand, you could say accumulation and alienation would be prohibited. But then you're back to the mythological Sparta. You can't have dynamism, you can't have transformation. So this was a problem that the cooperativists were unable to solve. And they were unable to solve it because they took for granted the entire existing apparatus of private law. So to solve that problem, you need to imagine a different way of organizing decentralized access to productive resources and opportunities. So even when they had institutional ideas, the institutional impulse didn't go far enough. And it's very interesting. It's a very useful study to go back and see what happened in these 19th century debates.
So this is what I'm trying to get to. That in my point of view, the problem is what if we take what you say, the analysis that you put very beautifully or discourse in front of us, is something that has scrutiny. There is a great shortage in people which, like lawmakers of a new society, people that will think economy in that new society. Because even me, when I try to establish with my movements things that are not in the same society, in the same law, I needed lawyers. And the lawyers that were equipped, they worked in the same institution of the current country. So there is a problem, because there is a problem of the chicken and the egg. I need to start building the alternative within the current system, but I don't have the professional help I need in order to do some of the building of the institution I need to have. Because I can find alternative economists like Danny Roderick, who's considered but a lawmaker? If we try to find a lawmaker that will help the country realize or accept another way of owning stuff, it's impossible. So how can you solve it?
Well, what you're saying is we need ideas, right? And so there has to be some division of labor within humanity. Not everyone works on transformation in the same way or at the same level. There has to be an idea element. And the idea element is not just in abstraction, in political theory. It has to invade the particular disciplines, especially economics and law, and establish a contest in those disciplines. What we were just talking about is an example of that. The fatal consequences of not having an alternative vision of property, of the ways of organizing economic decentralization. Yes?
I do not see the tension between deep freedom and deep equality. I think that in order to have deep freedom presupposes deep equality. Because I guess the infinite accumulation of wealth, as history has shown, leaves necessarily some sort of domination of the unsocial group by the other. And I guess what the liberal doctrine did was to mistaken the freedom of few for freedom of all, or I guess the opportunity to be free, to be politically, socially, economically free, for the actual freedom. So I guess in order to have this actual freedom, in order to have the freedom of all people, I mean, across social groups and economic groups,
Yes.
we need this equality as actual equality, not opportunity for such.
Well, meaning what? Meaning equality of circumstance, equality of outcome? We don't need that. I mean, we need to avoid extreme inequality, but it doesn't seem that we could, that we have reason to give priority to an extreme equality of outcome or of circumstance. It's incompatible with experimentation, with movement, with dynamism, and it doesn't seem to be what people in any real society want. They don't want that. They don't want to be all exactly equal. When the extremes of inequality are avoided, the question is, at what level? At a low level or at a high level? That's the issue.
But that reminds us of the social democracy doctrine. I mean, that's what we have done in the past, and I'm not sure if it's incompatible. An idea of equality is incompatible with liberalism.
No, but I think I think you're being unfair to the classical liberals in saying that they didn't value agency for everyone. They did. They were not theorists of aristocracy or oligarchy. There was a problem, and the problem is revealed in the evolution of modern legal thought. Following up on a remark that you made. So in the early 19th century idea of the system of rights, of self-determination, the notion was you have these rights of self-determination, they will give you freedom. They won't give freedom just to an elite, they'll give freedom to everyone. Then it turned out that that didn't happen. And it didn't happen because the ability to exercise these rights depends on certain practical conditions. So the rights are defeasible. They may fail if their practical conditions are not fulfilled. That then led to the most characteristic project of 20th century law, which was the project of reorganizing the whole of law as a dialectic between rights of individual and collective self-determination and rules or rights intended to ensure the practical conditions for the exercise of those rights of self-determination. And that happened in all over law. So, for example, within a branch of law, like contract law, the interaction between the rules of contract formation and the rules of economic duress. So if there's economic duress, contract is a facade. And then the problem was, what are the limits of the doctrine of economic duress? Because if all contracts celebrated between members of different classes are characterized by economic duress, then almost all contracts in society are invalid. Then the second way was by the relation between different legal disciplines. So labor law with respect to contract law. In the employment relation, there's inequality of bargaining power. So labor law organizes countervailing power to reestablish the reality of contract in the conditions of the employment relation. And finally, in the whole relation between public law and private law. So that was the 20th century project. Now, you might think that that would be just an intermediate step, and that the next step would be to then begin to reshape the institutional arrangements. Because once you ask yourself, what are the practical conditions, you discover that you have to invade the causal background of social life more and more. And there are different directions in which you can invade it. You can have a different diagnoses of the obstacles to the exercise of self-determination, and different directions. And then you've opened the agenda of institutional transformation in the details of legal thought. Now that's what didn't happen. So the strange thing about the evolution of legal thought is that it took this second step, but it didn't take then the third step. Why? The third step seems to be directly the consequence of the second step. But in reality, the dominant forms of legal thought were the legal organization of this social democratic compromise. So they didn't take the third step. And you see that, for example, in one of the most striking features of the legal counterpart to the social democratic compromise, which was that a new body of public law, the public law of a regulatory and redistributive state, was superimposed on a largely untransformed body of private law. Back to the discussion we were having about LaSalle. LaSalle didn't have the right ideas about private law. So it's like an unfinished evolution. That's what's interesting, right? And that you can see this whole historical experience in every domain with new eyes when you view it from the perspective of the denied future.
We could say, of course, that that was the result of the disempowered people because of the lack of equality. But that's one explanation.
Yeah, well, but I think the whole discussion of equality begins, to break down at that point. Now, so the second step in my remarks is really very brief, and is a preliminary then to the third step. So the second step is to say something about the status of ideas of human nature. Ideas about human nature in a programmatic argument like this one. And all I want to say is that the assumption about the role of a conception of human nature in an argument, in these programmatic arguments, takes a position in a space defined by two unacceptable limits. So, one limit is the idea that there's no human nature, that it's just like a plastic clay. And we make a programmatic proposal, and the programmatic proposal presupposes that we'll become very different from what we are like now. We will be regenerated, we will be transformed. Now, a fatal objection to any programmatic proposal is that it require, for its realization, a radical change in what we are like now. So let's say that's one limit. We know that we're recalcitrant to change. So, of all of us, we can say what the poet Auden said of infants, that they would rather be ruined than changed. That's what we're like. So that's one limit in the argument. Now then there's the other limit, is that there's some stable essence of human nature that is outside of history and politics. And in particular, that we can distinguish the attributes of humanity into two classes. There'll be the invariant attributes, and then there'll be the variable attributes, the ones that change in history. Now, we can't do that, it seems, in any meaningful way, because anything that we want to classify as invariant turns out, in fact, to have varied in history. And we can make a case for this invariant element only if we define it so abstractly that it loses significance. So either it's empty, trivial, or it's the false claim that is reifying what is in fact historical. So the situation seems to be this, that everything about us is on the line in history. There's no aspect of our experience that cannot be modified by the transformation of society and culture. And we can't distinguish the variable from the invariant. So even the most intimate features of our subjective experience, the way, for example, that we experience jealousy, will be colored by the transformation of society and of culture. That's true. But it's also true that we're not a plastic clay, the other limit. And we change, but we change at the margin. Now, that's a kind of rough and ready compromise, but a recognition of the troubled and troubling problem of the role of assumptions about human nature in these political and programmatic arguments. Now, this idea, the idea that I've just stated, in the form of the avoidance of these two limits, is closely related to the argument I stated in an earlier class, in contrast to a central thesis of classical liberal political theory, the thesis that an institutional order or an order of right can be neutral among visions of the good. I say it can't be neutral. It can't be neutral because every organization of society, every system of institutions or of rights tilts the scales of human experience in one direction or another, encouraging some forms of experience and discouraging others. And that's just a restatement of the idea that I presented a moment ago, that everything about us is on the line in history, that there's not some part that's reserved or exempt from the historical transformation of society and of culture. But still capable of transformation only at the margin. So the false and dangerous ideal of neutrality has a kinship to the feasible and important ideal of openness and of corrigibility. We can't have neutrality. Neutrality is a pretext for its opposite, for the entrenchment of a sectarian vision of humanity. But we can have forms of life that are different experiments in humanity, but that admit a wide range of contradiction and that allow themselves to be changed, to be challenged and transformed in the light of experience from within. So that's the status of the ideas about human nature in these arguments. Those are the assumptions that I'm making. So I go on, or would someone like to question that before I go on to the third set of remarks, which is about the substance of the conception of humanity informing these programmatic arguments? Yes?
You talked about there is the first limitation, there is no human nature, and I want to get a little bit
No, well, wait a minute. It's not quite that there's no human nature. It's that there's no eternal essence. There's no stable element that's exempt from history. So the empirical claim about what is the most usable view of human nature in a programmatic argument is the following. What is human nature? Human nature is what we are like now. That's what human nature is. And it's not something eternal, because everything in the world changes sooner or later, though some things change quickly and other things change slowly. Human nature is what we are like now, and it can change. But characteristically, it changes at the margin. So in choosing one programmatic direction over another, among other things, we choose to develop certain aspects of our humanity rather than others, or to the prejudice of others. And that is, as it were, the tragic element in these political directions. They involve a suppression. And this tragic element is resolved, if it is resolved, in the history of humanity as a whole. So then, why are we against a world state? Because we want humanity to develop its powers and possibilities in different directions. And to develop its powers and possibilities in different directions, each of these experiments in humanity may need the shield of a state. But then the shield of a state comes with a cost, because then these states are grasping and armed, and they go to war with one another, and so forth. So this is the reality from which we start. But it's an explanation of why the pluralism of forms of social life and of states is valuable to us. So it's related to this view of human nature. There's no natural form of society, and humanity is not one thing, and it develops by developing in different directions. And what is even more paradoxical is that it unifies by diverging. So to become deeper, to develop our powers, we have to diverge. If we don't diverge, we don't develop our powers. If we don't develop our powers, we can't unite on a deeper basis. We unite as ants, not as human beings. And so these are the arguments, or this is the view of the role of human nature in these arguments.
So is the anchoring point of human nature in terms of both the unification and divergence the programmatic argument, or this visionary programmatic argument that we made?
So I'm not sure I understood this last question. So it is true, if I understand one aspect of your statement, that general conceptions of human nature are prophecies, among other things. They're not just empirical claims. So they are visions at once empirical and normative of who we ultimately or deeply are. And they're prophecies, and like all great political projects, they have an aspect of being self-fulfilling prophecies, because each of these prophecies tells us, in effect, act as if I were true, and you'll make me true. But they're not completely self-fulfilling prophecies, because reality fights back, and including our reality of what we're like now. So if the prophecies are too distant from what we are like now, then they're likely to fail and to produce results opposite to what they promise. So that's the situation. Now then we come to the third set of remarks that I wanted to make. Also schematically, about the substance of the assumptions regarding humanity in these programmatic arguments. And they are, in some loose sense, empirical views, but they're also the elements of a prophecy, like these self-fulfilling prophecies that we were just speaking about. So a major conception of a major aspect of the conception of humanity informing these programmatic arguments is that we are context-bound agents who transcend their context. So we are formed in particular social and cultural worlds. They make us who we are, but they do not exhaust us, either individually or collectively. There is always more in us than there is in them. More in us, in each of us as individuals, and more in us collectively, in the human race, in humanity. They, in relation to us, are finite. And we, in relation to them, are infinite. We spill over. There's an element of surfeit, of access, of transgression. And this fact penetrates every feature of our experience. So, for example, it is manifest in the nature of the mind, as I suggested in an earlier class in our discussion about education. The mind has two sides. In one side, the mind is like a machine. It is modular and formulaic. But in another side, the mind is an anti-machine. It is not modular. It is not formulaic. It can combine everything with everything else, the power that we call recursive infinity. And it has the ability to transgress its own presuppositions and to cast aside its own methods. To see something, to discover something that under its methods and assumptions cannot be. And then retrospectively to develop the methods and presuppositions that make sense of what it has discovered. That's what we call the imagination. And that's just another expression among many of this characteristic, of this fundamental characteristic of ours, of transcendence, or transgression, of excess. So we're shaped by these contexts, but we exceed them. That's the basic approach to humanity underlying these programmatic arguments. And so, in a sense, at that level, the question is, in what society can we become these context-transcending agents? Under what form of education? Under what organization of the economy? Under what organization of politics? What way of organizing society, given that every organization of society is flawed and that there's no structural blueprint to which we can definitively entrust ourselves, under what organization of society do we stand a better chance of becoming us under this view? So it's a conception of agency, then, that emerges from this. And that helps to flesh out, to develop the idea of greatness. Invoked in my first set of remarks. Now we can take one step further in the development of these ideas about agency. The experience of agency, of empowerment, the sentiment of being, as one philosopher called it, depends on the resolution of two sets of interlocking contradictions. One having to do with the relation between the self and other people, and the other having to do with the relation between the self and the social and cultural world in which it finds itself. Let's call that the structure. So we could say that it's the problem of the self and the others, and the problem of the spirit and the structure. If by spirit we mean the human being in the exercise of this power of transcendence, to use the theological vocabulary, according to which we are embodied and context-bound spirit. That's what spirit means. Spirit is just the designation of the aspect of transgression or transcendence. So the self and the others. To develop, we need connection. We develop only in connection. Practical connection, emotional connection, cognitive connection. But every connection threatens us with subjugation and depersonalization. So Sartre says, hell or the others. So this is one of the basic contradictions of agency. And we think, in this view, that we become freer and greater to the extent that we can resolve or diminish this contradiction, to the extent that we can have more connection with less subjugation or depersonalization, so that we don't have to choose between being unconnected and being subjugated. Now, how do we do that? Now, in the intimate sphere, the highest way in which we do that is love. And love is not altruism. So the position, the dominant position in the philosophical meta-ethics, what's studied as ethics in the academy, is largely organized around the theme of altruism. And all the main schools, utilitarianism or consequentialism, social contract, Kantianism, they're all philosophical theorizations of the idea of an altruistic universalism. And their perspective on the moral life is that it's like a book of accounts. So the central problem in morality is to pay my debts to the others. And therefore the idea of a moral life is that it's like a campaign of perpetual hand washing. The objection is to arrive at the end of your life, at the threshold of debt, with all of your debts paid and your hands clean. So it's like the ethic of Pontius Pilate. You've done nothing wrong. And it's an idea that the problem of obligation is what's central to the moral life. This is a travesty, of course, of the nature of moral experience. And we think, or we should think, that the highest reconciliation is love. Now, how does love differ from altruism? It differs along three main dimensions. First, because altruism is generosity from a distance and from on high. Love requires equality and engagement, closeness. Second, because altruism may require sacrifice, by definition, sacrifice, and even the ultimate sacrifice of one's life. But there's no intimate jeopardy. Love requires a heightened vulnerability and is in that way dangerous. And third, because there's no epistemological problem in altruism. Satisfying your obligations to the others, what you owe to the others. But in love, the threshold problem is the ability to imagine the other, the otherness of the other. And that's why there's some question about whether love is possible. Because the philosopher Heraclitus says that the soul of another person is like a dark continent that can never be visited. So is it just a projection of oneself onto the other? But that only works when it works, if it works, in the intimate sphere. So what then is the counterpart to love outside the intimate sphere? It's the higher forms of cooperation. That is the diluted or disseminated form of love, the counterpart to love in social life. And what are the attributes of these higher forms of cooperation? So now let me state them at the most abstract level. Unlike the exploration of the programmatic arguments of the course, which was in a particular historical context. So among these attributes are the following five. That first, the way in which we deal with the others should not be predetermined or prescribed by some position into which we were born, an order of classes or of castes. We should be free to cooperate, to invent new forms of cooperation. Second, the form of cooperation should not be pinned to a single dogmatic version of itself. Example, the argument about the market. The market should not be pinned to a single version of itself, a single dogmatic system of property and contract law. Third, we should be secure in a haven of vital protected interests and capabilities so that we can be unafraid. But the whole of social life around us should be thrown open to contest and experiment. So the reconciliation of this security in a haven of endowments with a storm around us. And the storm has to be organized. It can't just happen spontaneously. We should be like the seraph Abdiel in Milton's Paradise Lost, unshaken, unsubdued, unterrified, so that we can go out in the world and raise a storm. And then comes the fourth attribute of these higher forms of cooperation. In our dealing with our devices, the machines, we should be the opposite of them. They should do for us what we have learned how to repeat, so that we can reserve our supreme resource time for the not yet repeatable. And fifth, we should be free in our work in the world. Free labor should be really free. And economically dependent wage labor should give way in the course of time to the higher forms of free labor, self-employment, and partnership, or cooperation. So that's then an interpretation of what it means to be connected without being subjugated. outside the intimate sphere. And all of these programmatic arguments about the organization of politics and of the economy are just the circumstantial expression of this ideal. They're the interpretation in a particular historical context, given our points of departure, of what it means to establish these higher forms of cooperation. Now, looking at them from the standpoint of these ideas of human nature. So that's then one contradiction, this contradiction of self and others. We resolve it to the extent that we diminish this contradiction or resolve it, we become freer and greater. We have more being, more agency. But now there's a second set of contradictions which has to do with our relation to the structure, the particular social and cultural world that we're in. And here you could say that there are two opposing heresies. So I will follow the example of patristic theology and give them the names of persons. So one heresy, let me call the Hegelian heresy. So the Hegelian heresy is, there's a definitive structure. History evolves to an end. And in the end, there's one way of organizing society in which at last we can be at home. So what is the underlying problem? What is the contradiction? The contradiction, which is analogous to the contradiction of self and others, is that to develop, to be a self, to be empowered, to enhance agency, we have to participate in a world. But if we participate in a world, it seems that we have to surrender to it and become its puppet. On the other hand, if we stand aside and we're isolated, then we don't become puppets, but we can develop. So it's this choice between isolation and surrender. And then one solution, one false solution, one unacceptable solution to that contradiction is what I'm calling the Hegelian heresy. And then what is the other solution? The other solution, let me call the Sartrean heresy. So it's the romantic position, or the existentialist position. So what it says is this: the structures kill the spirit. They are the hand of Midas, killing the spirit. But they're inevitable. We can't change the relation of spirit to structure. What we can do is periodically shape the structure. And in these interludes in which we shake the structure, we will be really us. So romantic love, by contrast to the routines and conventions of marriage, the mob in the streets, the revolutionary fervor, by contrast to the bureaucratic apparatus, to the prosaic life of ordinary politics. So it's a kind of despair, a failure of hope. We despair of the possibility of changing the relation of spirit to structure. So those are the two limits, the two heresies. And what then is the path of progression? The path of progression is to find arrangements in society, in the organization of the economy and of politics, and the organization of education, that allow us to engage in a particular world without surrendering to it, so that we can be at the same time insiders and outsiders. And then we become free or freer. And that's another way to look at many of these programmatic proposals that I've made in the course. They're about that. They're about how we can engage without surrendering and be insiders and outsiders at the same time. So we have forms of economic and political life in which we can engage in them, but continue to challenge them or to disrupt them, because disruption is part of themselves. They're organized not just to allow disruption, but to foster it. So that's the conception. That is, as it were, the prophecy, which is animating many of these programmatic arguments, and a way of understanding them from a different angle. And in another sense, all of this that I've just said about the two contradictions, self and others in spirit and structure, is also an interpretation of the idea of shared bigness. The bigness, the agency, is through the resolution, the progressive resolution of those two sets of contradictions. All right, so I've completed now my third set of remarks, because I actually wanted to reserve some final part of the class for something else. But your comments. Of course, it's hard to have a philosophical discussion at the end of an inquiry, which wasn't itself mainly philosophical. But I think it's important to try and make explicit the philosophical assumptions animating these arguments. Yes?
So what haven of vital interest and capability will ever be secure in us such that we will be okay in the storm and not want either to prematurely terminate it or to allocate it onto other?
Absolutely. So it'll never be secure enough. It'll never be enough, right? So it's not as if there were ever some kind of definitive fix that we could have. In several senses. First, because, first of all, no degree of endowments and protections would ever be enough to make us completely unafraid, right? The question is whether we can have a degree of protection and equipment that allows us to pass a threshold in which we can be courageous enough, right? Because this is then one of the great paradoxes of worldly activity, that we have to be secure, and at the same time we have to be blown out of our ruts. And how can those two things happen? But this isn't just a philosophical speculation. This is a problem of organizing a form of life that is successful. The people in that form of life have to be willing to tolerate conflict all around them, because conflict comes with innovation. But they have to be secure enough and equipped enough that they can tolerate this activity around them. So remember, in an earlier class, I discussed this idea that different forms of social life can differ in the extent to which they separate or not the arrangements of social life from the guarantees of security. So the extreme form of a extreme pole of a spectrum would be a scriptural caste system in which the whole security and identity of the individual is engaged in the maintenance of a particular plan of social life. And what we would want on this view is to disengage the security from the general arrangements of social life as much as possible, to proceed toward the other pole of that spectrum. Now then comes the second problem, which is implicit in your remark, in your question. The second problem is that no way of defining the endowments or securities is itself secure against challenge and change, right? I mean, this is one of the confusions in the historical doctrine of natural rights or fundamental rights. So what do we mean by fundamental rights? There's a methodological element and a substantive element. The methodological element is we take something out of the agenda of short-term politics. One of the ways of doing that is by constitutional entrenchment in a democracy. So we say the basic rights are the rights that can only be changed by supermajorities. But that's not adequate, because there can be a supermajority that would change it. So then we say there's some other basis, a theological basis or a philosophical basis. So in different ways we try to tie our own hands so that the possibility of changing those fundamentals becomes unthinkable. But of course it is thinkable, and there's nothing that can't be changed. So in that sense, it's not fully guaranteed. That's the methodological element in substantive rights. And what's the substantive element? The substantive element, according to this view, is this interaction between the idea of being secure and being equipped in a haven and the throwing open of the surrounding social life to contestation. So it's the unconditional security and the storm. What I'm calling the storm is the plasticity. And the storm is not just something empty. The storm has to be organized. So the high energy democracy, the disseminated and radicalized form of the knowledge economy, are interpretations of the storm in the particular historical circumstance in which we find ourselves. But they require being related to this element of security.
Doesn't an organized storm make it fundamentally unstormable?
No, I don't think so. So I think you could say two things. I think the vocabulary may be confusing, right? But so there are two things that could happen, right? That would concern us. So one is the plasticity could generate too much conflict, too much experimentation. It would overwhelm us. We would be afraid, as you suggested at the beginning of your remarks, or the opposite, that if it's institutional, it's not storm-like. You know, so let's take an example from our earlier discussion. So this idea of conservative political science and conservative statecraft, that a form of politics is either hot and anti-institutional, or it's cold and institutional. But it can't be hot and institutional at the same time. So it either goes in the direction of Madison or it goes in the direction of Mussolini. And what that idea denies is that a form of politics can be both hot and institutional. In other words, that you can have political arrangements that elevate the level of organized popular engagement in political life, heighten the temperature of politics. And I'm saying that yes, you can. And that's not a contradiction. That there's a tension there, but not a contradiction. And it's the same argument that is happening in these other forms of. So, for example, if you compare now the organization of work under mass production with the organization of work in the most advanced forms of the knowledge economy, once again, it's the same thing. In the Fordist factory, the system is command and control. So coherence and momentum are achieved by quasi-military orders. In the advanced forms of the knowledge economy, there's a much more radical practice of decentralization and initiative to the individual participants and work teams, so that the process of production becomes more like a guerrilla operation, to use the military analogy, and therefore more storm-like. So those are all practical examples of what it means to become more storm-like.
I see people behaving as though there's already too much of a storm, and this is occurring within the virtual absence of experimentation. I wonder if it has anything to do with the hyper-presence of information and what you think, how you think digital culture reflects human nature and our amenability to storms. Do you think...
I don't think it reflects anything. I think, like every technology, it can mean radically different things, depending on the context in which it's used and on the way in which it's organized. But I think these questions that you bring are very legitimate, because how afraid will we be? What's the level of confusion in the outside world that we can tolerate? How can the confusion be both spontaneous and organized? These are obvious questions, and I think the answers to these questions lie in the details of the arrangements. And they apply not just to political and economic institutions, but to the form of education. Because the form of education that I defended has this same character. For example, the dialectical attribute, teaching everything from opposing points of view, as opposed to the idea of the transmission of a canonical body of knowledge. Yes?
You talked about one of your attributes being we should be the opposite of our machines and reserving our time for actions that are not yet repeatable.
Yes.
Do you find any value in tasks that could be repeatable? I immediately picture a musician practicing something and then performing that for an audience. Something that if a machine were to do, I imagine might not have the same effect.
So, but what's then the conclusion from that?
Is the hierarchy of more complicated tasks that utilize the imagination, in select cases, might that hierarchy sometimes not make as much sense? No,
absolutely. So, the philosopher Kierkegaard said, the war against repetition is a war against life. So repetition is a pervasive element of our experience. But the question is, will it take over? And how do we organize a dialectic between the repetitious and the non-repetitious? So in the previous dominant forms of production, the worker worked as if he were one of his machines. As I said, in Henry Ford's assembly line or Adam Smith's pin factory, the worker imitates the movements of his machines. And that is a lower level in the relation of the agent to the machine. So there's a moving frontier of what we've learned how to repeat. And as we learn how to repeat something, we can express it in an algorithm or a formula. And having expressed it in an algorithm or a formula, we can then embody it in a physical contraption. And then this alliance of the machine and the worker becomes much more powerful than the machine or the worker alone. Yes?
On the question, on your point about agency and empowerment,
Yes.
Under what organization of society do we become the transcendent task? I guess, wouldn't that agency perpetuate inequality?
Why? I mean, that's the debate about these forms. So that depends on the details of the forms of political, economic, and educational organization, right? So it's true that none of these alternatives can be reconciled with a commitment to a rigid equality of circumstance, of outcome. That brings us back to the debate we were having about the mythological Sparta. But they do require a wide diffusion of assets and stakes on the one side, and capabilities and opportunities on the other side. As the background, as the economic and political background to this shared bigness. Now, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I have two brief questions.
Yes.
The first one is, I understand that with the self and the other can subjugate the self and limit the self's agency. But in your discussion of this, is a cooperative engagement between the self and other actually further enhancing the agency of the self above the self?
Absolutely. So as in love, right? So in the experience in love is the hope, the promise of a connection with someone else, which instead of subtracting from us, adds, enhances our agency. And similarly, in what I'm calling the higher forms of cooperation, we have a connection with others, a way of working with them that lifts us up. So it's an answer to the problem of how we can be connected without being depersonalized and subjugated, and therefore a response to one of these two contradictions in our basic experience of self-assertion. So that's the fundamental idea, that the conditions of self-assertion are contradictory, because we need to be connected without being subjugated or losing ourselves. We need to engage in a particular world without surrendering to it. How can we do this? And this is not the answer to those questions is a practical answer. It has to do, on the one hand, with the organization of society, and on the other hand, with the conduct of life, right? Because here we're dealing with these problems collectively and politically. But there's another way in which we can deal with them, which is in our conception of how to live. And because we live in biographical, not in historical time, we don't get to choose our place in this historical progression. And the further we are from a collective solution to these problems, the more we need to have also our own solution in the way we live, so that virtue, so to speak, makes up for the failures of politics. It economizes on political success. Now, I wanted to save these last minutes in the class to talk about something else, which people often ask me about, and I want to discuss explicitly, as I have from time to time. And that is the development of your own minds, your formation, and how you can develop the education required for the pursuit of the themes that have been discussed in this course. So let me begin by saying some simple, relatively obvious things. The further you advance in your education, the more your education must be self-education. So beyond the very earliest stages, the idea that you can achieve most of your education in school or through courses is absurd. You have to educate yourself. The universities are, so first of all, as I've said, the orthodoxies of the university culture are based on the forced marriage of methods to subject matters, as in the example of economics. It's not the study of the economy. It's the study of a method. Fundamental physics is studied as an anti-historical discipline, but evolutionary biology is historical. Why? Now we know that the universe is historical. So these are these orthodoxies of the university culture, which induce the young to mistake the dominant ideas for the ways things are. The academics have the following characteristic trajectory. In their 20s, they master some argumentative and analytic apparatus in their disciplines, and then they spend the rest of their lives feeding material through that slot machine. And this is a kind of reversal or perversion of what should be the case, which is that there's some agenda, some vision, and then the methods are periodically burned up, discarded, because methods are a dime a dozen. And the universities are not good at ideas, at the experience of thought. They're filled with clever people who think that because they're clever, they should be entitled to have ideas. But there's very little relation between cleverness and insight. You know, Schopenhauer, I cited, makes this remark in The World as Will and Representation. He says, the talented person is a marksman who hits a target that others cannot hit. A genius is a marksman who hits a target that others cannot see. So we take this word genius, insight, discovery. It's not a form of power, a facility. It's not like a super cleverness. It's of an entirely different character. It's a form of vision. And you don't get to have vision by being very clever. There's no such connection. So then the issue is how you cultivate this power of vision. The university is good at some things, at transmitting a canonical body of knowledge, and above all, at skills, humdrum prosaic skills, like solving problems in mathematical physics or learning to speak German or something like that. But what it's bad at are ideas, for all these reasons that I just alluded to. So then you have to make up for this in order to be able to pursue these large projects, like the project that we've attempted to pursue and discuss here. The most common defect in the education of educated people in these societies is an inadequate acquaintance with the history of philosophy. This is a defect that you can remedy. And one way to begin remedying it is to study the history of philosophy, and also the history of classical social theory. Now, in general, the professors look down on secondary works, but it's very stupid, because there are excellent secondary works that are good introductions to the history of philosophy. For the history of philosophy, I in particular recommend the history of philosophy called A History of Philosophy in 9 volumes by the English Jesuit Frederick Copleston. And for the history of classical social theory, I recommend a work by the French social and political theorist Raymond Aron, A-R-O-N, Main Currents in Sociological Thought. But what you should do, having read these works of introduction, is to select a few thinkers, a philosopher and a social theorist, and to read everything that they ever wrote. Now, because that's the best way to form your mind. In contrast, in tension with some other mind. Now, not necessarily a thinker with whose ideas you sympathize. It might be a thinker with whose ideas you antagonize, who is, in it were, the opposite, the inverse of yours. And then study everything that that person ever said or wrote. And then, aside from philosophy and classical social theory, imaginative literature, which is the chief source of our insight into human nature. So the writings of the philosophers about human nature, the writings of philosophers like Kant or Hume about human nature, seem like cardboard compared to what we find in the European novel of the 19th and 20th century, and in great imaginative poetry. So if you study philosophy, the history of philosophy, of the fundamental ideas in our civilization, and classical social theory, culminating in the work of Karl Marx, and the imaginative literature of the last few centuries, as well as the work of the great poets, then you have the basis to free yourself from your historical circumstance and reduce the university to its proper function, which is the provision of these lower level skills. It's unreasonable to expect inspiration from these institutions. If you can find 2 or 3 people who can inspire you, you should judge yourself extraordinarily lucky. But you don't necessarily need the living to inspire you, although that's better. You can be inspired by the dead. And so it requires a forceful act on your part of taking control of your agenda and forming a mind. Forming a mind that's capable of resisting, that's capable of transcending, that's capable of seeing beyond the immediate circumstance. And it seems very appropriate that I should recommend this procedure to you, since we just spent the last 2 hours discussing the idea of greatness. Well, we have one more class, and as I've said, I don't intend to make any statement in that class. I want you, individually and collectively, to lead the agenda in our last class, and to come with your propositions and arguments. See you next week.
If anyone has questions about their final paper, I have office hours right now. I'm happy to talk, including grad students if you want.
Not all of them. ממש מקום. מקום די משעמם. אני פה, תשמע, יש ויש ויש, אתה רוצה מחר שעה 4 עד 6. תן לי להיות בזה. סבבה? הצעות כמו מכרזים, יש לו מכרזים. בארץ? לא, אם יגיד לי ראש אגף אני אמסור הגשת מכרזים דברים
Right, I know. Stupid out.
Oh, it's just an agreed.
And then some that's missing. That's great. Inspiration. You're creative. And they also have insecurity.
He's not using his own education.
Yeah, I
There's
think
Like, it's kind of like, you can't expect that here, and also I'm not a good
But you know what it was like? This is
If
being
you're
taught
bigger
for
than
both sides.
the
Being taught twice.
I agree. I think it's just good. Yeah, because it's like his class. Oh, yeah, the hand does.
No, he does one, like brief. He does one about, it's him. Anyway, there's it's very famous at Kennedy School,
And they teach from
is conservative.
Oh, I see.
And so they teach back and forth.
Oh, that's
Based on
fun.
the conversations we do.
Oh.
I wonder if there is more.
Yeah, that'd be fun. That'd be really fun.
Yeah. Enjoy class. Thank you.
It's serious aspect of really the whole
O limite é isso. Tem que ficar assim. Sim, lógico que você vai debater ideia. Você chega em 1 grau de dividir ali. Você vai levando. Não, é que não dá para passar. Essa dividida vai. Ah, e nem o limitador tem isso. E o limitador do carro. Uma relação. Muito. Ah, muito. Não é uma relação boa com ela. Mas é. Não, tem lá, né? Ela vinha pra cá, ela lá e deixava pra ele lá. É completamente fora da casa.